Good evening. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about questioning. So in a little over 15 years as being an educator, I've asked a lot of questions. I've asked students questions like, what instrument family is a trumpet in? Who's Louis Armstrong? How many counts does a whole note get? Questions to teachers like, what routines are you working on building in your classroom? And what are the expectations you have for your low-performing students? What strategies do you use to engage students? At the time asking those questions, I thought those were pretty good. But they all have something in common. And let's look at this taxonomy here to kind of talk about what it is they have in common. So this kind of gives us different levels of how deep we go into our thinking for questioning. And looking back at the ones that I asked, they're all pretty much low-level questions. You know, what instrument family is a trumpet in? Well, it's in the brass section. So, not very complicated, we're just recalling the information. What I learned from cognitive coaching training was that if we really want to help somebody with their thinking, we want to take them deeper. We don't want to just ask them questions that they can just recall an answer off the top of their head and then they're done. And so when the application firms came out for this, I thought, well, that's a really great thing to talk about. As I was interviewing with the leaders of TEDx at TCIS, they asked me, well, how does that apply to students? Which kind of stumped me at the moment. The training I went through was probably 10 to 12 days of in-class training over months of time, and not realistic for students. But it intrigued me because I thought about, well, what's the basic premise of cognitive coaching? And really it's about helping others think about their thinking. And that really fit with what the objective of tonight is to rethink, which for me was, okay, well, what's a common everyday thing that I don't think too much about? And let's look at it from a different perspective. So with cognitive coaching, how can I rethink it and make it work for students? And not just students, it'd really be for anybody. So I'll talk about cognitive coaching and what it is, a little bit about how it can be a positive influence on people, and then we'll talk about, does it work with everybody else? And then at the end, you can kind of be the judge as to whether I've made my case or not. So through the cognitive coaching training, we can see how questioning changes by this being one question I may have asked a teacher at one point, and moving it to how might routines support management and allow for students to be more engaged. It's a more open-ended question, should take the teacher a little bit deeper into his or her thinking as to what routines they're using, why are they using them, and how are they going to support the students more, as opposed to, I can make a list of the routines I'm using. Same thing for these two. How high expectations for low students? Well, hopefully we have high expectations for our low-performing students, but really we want to talk bigger. And if we're asking teachers a question, we want them to go deep in their thinking. As you look at those, you can see how we've gone from simple recall to a much bigger topic. So, how does cognitive coaching work? Well, the basic idea is, according to Garmstrom, Linder, and Whitaker, it's a process during which teachers explore the thinking behind their practices. And really, it was started for teachers, but we could take that word out and use coachee, the person the coach is talking to, because really it works for anybody. They explain that in cognitive coaching, questions asked by the coach reveal to the coachee areas of thought that may not be complete or consciously developed. And when people talk out loud about their thinking, their decisions become more clear to them and their awareness increases. That's the whole idea of what we're going for. Somebody's thinking about whatever the topic is somewhere here, and we try to help them get up here. The coach does that by leading their coachee through planning, reflective, or problem-solving conversations. by paraphrasing what the person says and asking them questions. So, to give you an example, because it's always easier to understand things by using a context. My last job, I supervised the receptionist for the school district's main office. And he was really great at welcoming people to the main office, giving them instructions about where to go or walking them there. But he had other jobs. For example, he needed to put job announcements on our school website. He posted teacher openings on websites across the region at universities, managed reservations in the boardroom, managed applications for volunteers. To put it nicely, he wasn't great at any of that. My supervisor worked with him for a year without finding much success and decided that next year he would become my project and my job to help him become more successful. I'm not very proud to say, but my opinion was that if he wasn't doing his job, we should just fire him, which really shouldn't be my focus as an educator. I should and have since changed my opinion in that if somebody's got the desire, we should be able to build the ability within them. It's hard to build desire, but we can build knowledge and skills. So I also found out when I first got him that firing him wasn't an option. He was so good at talking that he'd built quite a relationship with the superintendent, and they were great buddies at that point. So it was really, how do we help him grow? And basically the way I did it was using a rubric, having him begin identifying where he felt he was on that scale. It was 1 to 4, 4 being the highest. And he went through and basically circled where he thought he was, put some evidence. And then through a reflective conversation, we began talking about, is that where you're at? And why do you think that? What's your evidence? Some things he moved down, some he left them where they are. By the end of our conversation, he pretty much was 1 and 2s all the way through the entire evaluation. However, you would think that somebody leaves that kind of meeting a little on the dejected side. How can you be happy about your job performance when you've left a talk, you're at 1s and 2s, you really need to be at 3s and 4s. However, through the paraphrasing and the questioning, he had been able to come up with a few areas where he could see ways to start making growth, where he could go from a 1 to a 3 or a 2 to 3, and he had come up with plans for getting there. So he was excited about going out there and trying that. Over the course of about 6 months, I worked with him, and his progress was amazing, to put it one way. He still wasn't going to be a model for the top worker in the district, but he was no longer that guy that did really good at greeting people, and that was all he did well. He was actually managing all the other stuff he was supposed to, which in a lot of ways surprised me that he could make that quick a jump. The important thing I learned was that, as the cognitive coaching training talked about, the change doesn't come from outside. The reason he made those changes wasn't because I told him how to do the job. I could have, and it would have been easier, but because he identified ways to grow and get better, and it was from inside that he made the change. And so really the point to take from it is that coaching is guiding others through their thinking and not solving their problems for them. And the questions are ones that students could ask or anybody else. For example, questions like, what might be your thoughts about fill in the blank? What are some of the possibilities? As you examine the data, what are some of the trends that you notice? All of these questions, they're not just simple, here's the answer. And it really, as somebody asks them and you start thinking about them, the way I might answer them would be different than somebody else might answer them. And so they're personal in that sense, and it relies on that person's, their knowledge to help get there. So what does effective and ineffective questioning look like? And as I've been working on this talk, ineffective, I didn't want to change it, but I think it's worth noting that I'm not sure there are necessarily ineffective questions in general. It depends on what it's ineffective at. If the point is we're going to go deeper, then if I ask a question like, what instrument family is a trumpet in, that's not an effective question for going deep. It's a brass instrument, and that's kind of the end of the talk. So as I say ineffective here, we want to go deeper, and we want to make sure effective questions will take us there. So Richard, Paul, and Linda Elder explain in their Critical Thinking Handbook that thinking is not driven by answers, but by questions, that should be the focus of education. They explain that questions define tasks, express problems, and delineate issues. Answers, on the other hand, often signal a full stop in thought. Only when an answer generates a further question does that thought continue its life as such. And so what we kind of have to do is decide where is it that we want to go with our thinking. Doctors Hassed and Chambers in their book Mindful Learning describe 3 levels, and they fit our thinking as well as our learning. So surface learning is doing as little as possible and still passing. Achieving is attempting to get the highest grade possible without any real care or concern about how does this apply to me in the future. And deep learning is focusing on becoming as competent in that skill as possible. The types of questions we ask indicate where we see ourselves falling. So a surface learner might ask, how much do I have to do to get a passing grade? Is that going to be on the test? An achieving student might ask, how much do I have to do to get an A or a 7? Where a student focusing on deep learning might ask questions such as this. What could have led to this? What do you think would happen next if, again, fill in the blank? How might these people be connected? Again, we're looking at open-ended questions. They're not simple. There's no straightforward answer. And they may actually lead to more questions. As we talked about that definition, that's a good thing. We want to ask more questions. So I've mentioned open-ended a couple times, so let's look at what that is real quick. Close-ended, one answer or so. It's simple. There's not a lot to it necessarily. So, for example, at what temperature centigrade does water boil? We could say 100 degrees. We could be a stickler and talk about pressure and altitudes and stuff, but in general, this is a closed-ended question isn't going to take us as far as an open-ended. Or an open-ended question might be, what could have led to the worldwide childhood obesity epidemic that we are currently experiencing? To try and answer that would begin a list of a whole bunch of questions like, what countries are we talking about? How does the eating habits in those countries affect this? And it's digging and digging. There's a whole lot more to it than just a simple answer. And if we're thinking about taking somebody deep in their thinking, we want to ask that type of question. So, as I've said, coaching is involving those questions, those open-ended questions, but also paraphrasing. And before we even start doing that, we have to make sure that we're aware of our own biases so that we can listen non-judgmentally. If we're truly helping somebody think about their thinking and become more self-reflective and self-directed, then it has to come from the inside for them. And if we're aware of our biases, if we're listening non-judgmentally, then we're not pushing on them how we think they should deal with a situation or solve a problem. For example, I said that with the receptionist, he was in charge of setting up the boardroom. Well, I spent a lot of time in college setting up rooms in a student union and had some experience in that. And so he would come up with ideas as I was coaching him. And in the back of my mind, I'm saying, yeah, that's really not the best way to do that, or it's really inefficient. However, it's pushing that thought out of your mind and letting them go. Later on, it might be another coaching conversation to have them reflect on how efficient they are. But for now, he was coming up with ideas that would work for him. And as I said, when you come out of a conference where you've just been told your job performance is really bad, but you're excited because you've got a plan for getting better, that's the positive side of that. So the first thing we do is listen non-judgmentally. Then looking at paraphrasing, which Merriam-Webster defines as a restatement of a text, passage, or work giving the meaning in another form, or basically taking something and putting it in your own words. That's what you do. A coach spends most of their time doing that. And basically the reason is that if you're trying to help somebody think, and they tell you something and you say it back to them in a different way, it gives them the opportunity to hear that from a different perspective, or hear their thought from a different perspective. And then you give them the opportunity to say, well, yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, and I agree with what you're saying as a paraphrase. It also gives them the ability to say, wait, that really wasn't what I was saying. And so they have to say what they were saying or thinking again, which helps them clarify their thinking better. And they become clearer on their thinking in that process. Which ties us to the next thing with questioning, is clarifying questions. So our paraphrase may help them with clarifying, but then we also specifically ask questions that help clarify, to ask them to be more specific and less vague. Because how can we think about what's working and what's not if we're thinking about things in a broad, general term? The other ones I mentioned were mediative questions, which engage and transform the thinking of the coachee. It's the questions where, as opposed to saying specific things, you're asking questions more like, what might the answer be? So that you're leaving it as broad as you can, so that I'm not guiding them down a pathway. I'm simply asking a question that they can go where they need to go for their own thinking. Now, however, as I talk about the clarifying and the mediative, if you have no training in that, really the focus is to try and ask open-ended questions. So this is what it looks like for a coach, or really anybody else that's trying to help somebody in their thinking. We ask questions, open-ended questions. We paraphrase. It could be paraphrase, 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 paraphrase. We throw in a question, paraphrase, a question. It just depends on the person you're working with. It could be as simple as a few paraphrases and they hit that aha moment. That because you've said it back to them, it's completely changed how they see their own thinking, and they've gotten to a new point, which is what we're looking for. That's the big picture. About helping another person go to a higher level or a deeper level in their thinking. Thank you.